Left the puck for Bourne, rounds the net, starts up quickly on the right wing side, out to center ice. Look at this speed. Bourne across the line, around Tonelli, shoots, he scores! End to end. Bobby Bourne did it all.
Gillies out. Out of Borne with Goring. Shot, save, Cheevers. Screaming shot by Borne. He has great talent. Skating, shooting. Puck not cleared. Bounces in wide of Cheevers. O'Reilly fails to clear. Bourne shoots, scores! Bourne intercepted the clearing pass by O'Reilly. Drilled it from 45 feet. And for the second night in a row, quickly, the Islanders win in overtime, 5-4. Bob Bourne, the hero there.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, a special hello goes out to the Director of Media for the Boston Bruins alumni, Mr. Mark Bourne. I see you, Marky.
Welcome to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. This show is created to give a voice to former pro players and personalities, allowing them to share some of the greatest stories this game has to tell. So let's take a trip to the heart of the classic hockey universe and celebrate the history of the game with the select few who actually lived it. Episode 67 of the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast features New York Islanders Hall of Famer Bob Bourne, whose speed, skill, and versatility were key components in the Islanders' 4 Stanley Cup wins in the 1980s. In his 14-year NHL career, Bob scored 30 goals twice, 20 goals 3 times, was a member of Team Canada in 1984, and was awarded the Masterton Trophy for dedication to hockey in 1987. In this discussion, Bob reveals the inside story of his rise to the NHL and delivers great insights on legendary teammates such as Mike Bossy, Bryan Trottier, Clark Gillies, John Tonelli, Denis Potvin, and many more. As always, I thank you for helping us become the premier classic hockey podcast around the world. We greatly appreciate the kind reviews and awesome ratings you've left for us on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. Now, let's talk classic hockey with Bob Bourne. Speed, skill, and character. That's how the New York Islanders described our next guest on his Hall of Fame plaque when he was inducted into their Hall of Fame in 2014. He's a 4-time Stanley Cup champion. His number retired by the Saskatoon Blades, member of the Saskatchewan Sports Hall of Fame, and, of course, a Masterton Trophy winner in 1987 via the National Hockey League. So we're proud to have with us today Bob Bourne. Bob, thanks for being with us.
No problems, Mark. I appreciate it.
Bob, living in Saskatchewan, there were no teams anywhere near you geographically. So growing up, was the NHL something you had in your mind as a possible goal of yours, or does that seem too far out of reach?
It seemed too far out of reach, to be honest with you. Like, we were so far away, and I really didn't give it a second thought. I loved to play, and we were fortunate. My brother and I got to go into this little town of ours and skate every night for 3-4 hours. And my dad was an avid hockey fan, and of course, the first game I ever saw was on black and white. But he immediately switched it over to color about a year later. So yeah, we Saturday nights were sacred to our family, and I just kept playing, and I was just playing for fun.
I heard you say somewhere along the line that you did have a figure skating influence early in your life. Was that the case?
It is true. Yeah, like we grew up about 2 miles away from this little town called Netherhill, just outside of Kindersley, and I took figure skating for, I think it was around 4 years. Just any time for me to get on the ice was a blessing for me. So, yeah, I went and did it. You
mentioned that, and I think of eventually how you were so well known for your incredible speed on the ice, and I think locally of a player named Robbie Ftorek, who, when I was growing up, was well known that when he was younger, he started out figure skating, and then, of course, he became one of the better skaters in hockey as well. So that was time well spent. But when did you start actually playing organized hockey?
I did not have a game until I was 12 years old. Kindersley, like where I went to school and where all my sports were, but I didn't have an organized game until I was 12. Nervous as can be going in there and didn't know what to expect, but yeah, that's where things kind of got started.
That's amazing not to start till 12 years. Usually the thing that drops off when you start playing organized hockey late is the skating, but that's something that you had already mastered. Jumping ahead, you end up becoming a member of the Saskatoon Blades. And how did that process go? Were you scouted by the Blades, and how did that all come about?
Well, it's kind of a weird story. I was sitting at home one day, and I think Mom went in to get the mail and stuff and came out, and there's an envelope there from the Medicine Hat Tigers. And in those days, all it said was you have been selected by the Medicine Hat Tigers, and they had lists in those days. They could list, I think it was around, I don't know how many guys, but they had a list, and I was on their list. And training camp starts here, and so I was a little disappointed because, Saskatoon was basically where everything was centered for our family. We had a lot of family in there, and I'd been listening to the Blades on the radio for a couple of years, and I just wanted to go to Saskatoon. So my dad says, "Well, you're not going to Medicine Hat." So we just worked it out. I went to the Blades camp, and Jackie McLeod made a trade with Jack Shoup, was the GM of Medicine Hat at the time, and he made a trade in training camp, and away it went.
What was it like? The Western League obviously was a league. Was a tough league to succeed. You did have to be tough. You're a young guy going in there your first year. You've got some interesting, high-profile teammates, guys like Pat Price. At that point, later would be Bernie Federko. Larry Sacharuk was on your first team. So hopefully in practice you stayed away from the net when he was shooting. Ralph Klassen, guys like that. But what was it like for a young guy like yourself jumping into junior hockey?
Well, the funny thing was all I wanted to do was go to school. All I wanted to do was play for the University of Saskatchewan Huskies. And I wanted to go to school, and I wanted to get it was either going to be geology or architecture. So I applied for school, and I was taking 5 classes a day. But I had a very good friend, Mr. David Lewis, who I grew up with in Kindersley, and Dave played a long time in the NHL, and he's coached a long time. But one morning we were rooming together in Saskatoon, and he says, "Come on, get up." And he says, "What for?" And he says, "We got training camp this morning." And I says, "No, I'm going to school." And he was a big, tough guy. He says, "No, you're coming. You're coming." So anyway, he talked me into it, and away it went. And, things just went day by day after that. And I ended up just playing junior. And but it was intimidating for me. I was just this green farm kid, and didn't know what to expect. And I enjoyed school. So anyway, but I found out that, I wasn't a bad player, and I could kind of compete. And things just kept getting better and better. And, I ended up having a pretty good rookie year.
Oh, you sure did. And during that era, you would have played against a couple of individuals who would become very prominent in your life later. I'm speaking of Clark Gillies of Regina Pats and Bryan Trottier of the Swift Current Broncos. What are your recollections of being an opponent of those two at a young age?
Well, the biggest thing for me was, Clark was a giant when he was 17, and I was 6'4", but I weighed about 140 pounds. So Clark was a man when he was 17, and it was scary playing against him. But the advantage that he and I had was we both signed contracts with the Houston Astros and played baseball, and so we went down to. He was there a year ahead of me, but I went down to Cocoa Beach in Florida to the Houston Astros training camp after our season was over. And then he and I ended up going to Covington, Virginia, and playing on the same team. So I got to know Clarky very well. I mean, we hung out every day. I mean, we had a lot of similarities. We were both from Saskatchewan. We both played hockey. So we just hung out every day. So playing against him the next 2 years was much easier. And then Bryan was just Bryan. He was that way his whole career, kind of nondescript. Not a Connor McDavid speed or anything like that. But Bryan just got the job done, and I still say Bryan Trottier is in the top 5 of all hockey players I've ever lived. And he was sneaky good, strong as an ox. And so it was a real honor, and that's one of the reasons why I ended up being with the Islanders was Bryan was going to be there, and Clark was going to be there, and a lot of Saskatchewan guys.
No question, big Saskatchewan influence on that dynasty. But first I wanted to go back to, it's pretty amazing from a regular, relatively small area in Canada that both you and Clark Gillies had baseball opportunities. I was curious, what position did you play, Bob?
I was a first baseman. Clarky was a catcher.
So eventually you decide to stick with the hockey course, and in your draft year, you're selected by a new team, the Kansas City Scouts, and I was curious how you heard about that. Did you know anything about this expansion team when you had heard you had been drafted by them?
Well, all I knew was that there was an expansion team coming in, and it was Kansas City, and I never gave it any thought. And I found out my girlfriend at the time was a teller at a bank, and I walked in, and she says, "I hear you're going to Kansas City." And I said, "What?" Because in those days there was no one went to the draft, and no one had called me by this time. But apparently it was on the news and on the radio before I even got to see her. But that's what happened. She told me I was going, and I said, "Okay, well." It's not bad, I might have a chance to play. But in the long run, it really worked out well.
That's for sure. Now, you also were drafted by the WHA's Indianapolis Racers. Now, at that time, especially in your draft year, there's quite a bidding war going on. We talked about Pat Price. We talked about Dennis Sobchuk, Ron Chipperfield, guys like that going to the WHA. Had you had any discussions with the Racers at all?
We did for a little bit. Actually, quite a while that summer. We did. We went back and forth, and I was negotiating with Kansas City at the same time, and obviously neither one of those worked out. And I'll tell you what, Mark, here's what happened. I'll get the story over with. Was Ed Schmelf was the president of the Western Canada Hockey League at the time, and Ed grew up in my hometown of Kindersley. And so my dad and him were kind of friends. They were, they knew each other and stuff. And so I went to see Ed in Saskatoon. This was a week before training camp. And I told him the story. I said, I can't come to a deal with Indianapolis or Kansas City. He says, where do you want to play? And I said, I want to play with the New York Islanders. And the reason being was Clark was going to get drafted. Trottier got drafted. There was Lauren Henning. There was Gary Howard. There were a couple guys, like Bobby Mason was from Calgary. I knew a lot of those guys.
Yeah.
And I said, I want to play in New York. And he said, okay, what kind of money do you want? So I told him, I said, this is what we're looking for. And he says, okay, go out in the lobby. He came out half an hour later, and the deal was done. The contract was signed, and I was off to New York. So he went and phoned Bill Torrey, and they were buddies, and they got the deal done right there.
Right, and your life, of course, would never be the same. A lot of people, I talked to I talked to a lot of guys who played, for example, in Kansas City during that time period, and sometimes fate intervenes in life, and you end up as being a good player with a franchise that struggles, and your career can go one way. You were going the other way. You were going to a team that was on the rise with an absolutely, and this deal being another example of it, genius general manager in Bill Torrey.
Yes, he was.
Absolute. Yeah. His performance, I'm not telling you anything you don't know or our fans know, but his performance between 1972 and right through the 80s was as good as anything that the game has ever seen. But you find yourself in training camp now in a National Hockey League training camp in 1974. What was that experience like, being now coming to camp with pro players?
Well, I was scared to death because here's why. The summer before that, when Clark and I were playing baseball in Virginia, the last day of the season in late August, I had slid into second base and I tore up my knee.
Oh.
So I had to come home, and this is my draft year in hockey. I was devastated. Anyway, I had an operation on my knee, cleaned up all the cartilage and stuff like that. I didn't skate till late January that year in my draft year. So, it really hurt my draft position. But so when I got to camp, obviously, Clark was the number one pick. I think he was number 2 overall. But, he was the golden boy. And in those days in training camp, they put all the pros on the inside of the room and then all the prospects on the outside of the room. Mm-hmm. So I was very nervous. My knee still wasn't perfect, but I had a really good training camp. And then also in those days, I would end up playing 2 exhibition games a day. I would play with the minor league team, which was the Fort Worth Texans, and I would play with the Islanders. And I think I played 18 exhibition games that year.
Wow.
So it was intimidating, but I played very well and just had a great camp. And the day we were supposed to, everyone was going to New York, and the minor league team was going off to Fort Worth. And Mr. Arbor came up and he says, "You're packing the wrong bag." And I says, "What do you mean?" Because I was throwing in my stuff in the Fort Worth Texans bag.
Oh, wow.
And he goes, "No," he says, "Put that out in the bag right there." He says, "You're coming to New York." So I was really excited. And we played a couple more exhibition games in New York and then started the season. And I got off to a really good start. So that's kind of how it went.
Bob, tell me about your first National Hockey League game, stepping out there in an Islander jersey, and who was it against, and do you have any memories of that first game?
Oh my God, I remember every minute of it.
Mm-hmm.
We're playing, I'm a kid and I'm watching TV, watching the playoffs, in the spring with my dad and my brother. And so the very next, few months later, and Montreal was in the finals that year. And so my very first game is in the Forum in Montreal, and Al starts, myself, Gary Howard, and Bobby Nyson as a forward line. And we are against Guy Lafleur, Jacques Lemaire, Steve Schutt, Guy Lapointe, and Larry Robinson.
Well, there's
and
6 Hall of Famers, not a bad way to start.
Yeah, you talk about being a little bit nervous, but we ended up losing the game 3-1, but we played well, our line played well. Albany was so brilliant. We had such a great defensive system, and we kind of shut them down. But it was amazing walking into the Forum the first time. And, when you open the door, you can just smell hockey.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was so excited. So tired because I was so nervous. But we got through it, and I think we gained a lot of respect that night.
No question. And the team now is just in its 3rd year of existence. You end up getting into the playoffs very late in the season, maybe in the last game against the Rangers. And this is kind of forgotten about in Islander history because everybody obviously fixates on the dynasty years, the Stanley Cup. But one of the most remarkable seasons in Islander history was that year 3, your rookie season. You go into the playoffs, and shock everybody by beating the Rangers. And then a series I remember very well, just because we had it on TV here in Boston all the way through, because the Bruins had been eliminated by that point, is falling behind the Pittsburgh Penguins for 3 games and then coming back to win in 7. And, of course, almost doing the exact same thing in the third round against the Flyers. What are your memories of that 1975 playoff run?
Well, certainly, I think the biggest memory is after we went down 3-0 against Pittsburgh, at the start of practice one day, Al Albert came out, and he said, I'm totally serious about this. And he says, I won't be hurt. But he said, if there's anybody on this ice that believes we can't come back, he said, I want you to take your stuff off right now and go home. And he just explained it in a way that it just inspired you. So we ended up going out there and we beat them in the 4th game in New York and go back and beat them again in their building and beat them in our building. And then we had to go for Game 7 in Pittsburgh. And Eddie Westfall won. I think the score was 1-0, but and we were the second team ever to do that. And then, of course, we got to play Philly, and same thing kind of with Philly. And we had such a young team. We were like a little bit intimidated, and Philly won the Cup the year before, or the 2 years before. Mm-hmm. So we were intimidated, and we kind of let them walk all over us for the first couple of games, and then we got more physical, and we won the next 3. And and then in Game 7, of course, there was a weird face-off right at the start of the game, and Gary Dornhofer was on his side of the red line, and he just took a soft shot towards the net, and Chico Rush was in net, and Chico didn't see it and went in, and the building went crazy, and that was kind of it. They kind of took over. They beat us, 5-2, and they were probably the better team at the time. Right, but they were a great team at the time, as you know, went on to win the Stanley Cup. So it was. I remember watching that Game 7, and it was just a Cinderella story, to be sure. You did mention a player very familiar to our Boston audience, which of course is number 18, Eddie Westfall. Talk a little bit about Eddie, his leadership and his influence on yourself and that young Islander team. Well, the greatest thing about Eddie was we were so young, and, he was tough on us. And that's the one thing I appreciate about what Eddie did was, it wasn't all, sugar and cookies. It was, he would embarrass you in front of everybody, but he did it the right way. And Eddie just loved to play hockey, and that was his game, and he was so smooth and stuff. And obviously, he was at the end of his career, but yeah, I think it was just the tough approach to being a team, and he really loved Al and how everything was going. And Eddie was a big influence in my career. I don't know if I've ever told him that, but it was tough love. From the teammate, and I had so much respect for him because he played so long. So I just kind of followed the things he was doing, and he was a good man.
No question about that. The following season, Bryan Trottier arrives on the scene for the Islanders, and so you've got a lot of centers in the organization at that point. Yourself, Lauren Henning, Andre Saint-Laurent, and Ralph Stewart, and you find yourself, along with Pat Price, in Fort Worth, Texas for this a large part of the 75-76 season. So you have a strong rookie season. You find yourself in the Central Hockey League in year 2. What's your mental approach at that point? How did that all come about, and how did you you led the team in scoring, so I guess your attitude going down there, just work yourself out of it and get back up to the NHL.
Well, I think I was so embarrassed because I had a really good rookie year, and then I kind of my family was building a cabin that year in northern Saskatchewan, and so I didn't work out a whole lot. And there's no excuses. I just didn't put enough into it because I thought there's going to be no problems coming back, and we'll just get ready for the second year. And I had a lousy training camp. I came in about 10 pounds overweight, and I just had a bad training camp. And Bill and Al sat me down, and they says, "Look, we want you to go down there. You're going to be our captain, and just go and work hard." And I went to the minors, and I had so much fun. Like, Fort Worth is such a beautiful town, and we just had a great group of guys. And I put my nose to the grindstone and just played hard. And then at the end of the season, I got called up a couple times that year and played a few games. But anyway, at the end of the season, I went up and we kind of had a long playoff run then too. I didn't get to play, but I was around the team a lot. And so that summer when I went home, I said, okay, this is going to end. I got the best shape of my life. I was just determined to make the team. And most people will say I certainly wasn't a fighter in junior, but by the third year of my NHL term, I learned how to fight because Bobby Nystrom made me learn how to fight.
Right.
And so I had to become more physical because I was a bigger guy. I put on a lot of weight, a lot of muscle, and I just got more involved and had a really good training camp, and we just went from there.
Well, you could tell on some of those, you see them on YouTube, some of your highlights, if you'll highlight clips of your fights. You've got a strong left hand going, and I noticed one fight you had with a guy Brad Maxwell, who went toe-to-toe with Stan Jonathan once in a brutal match. I mean, a good fighter, and you got the edge on him, landing those lefts. So I know at that time of hockey, there was something that I think was something that's missing from the game right now, and it's I guess you call it accountability. And on one of the clips, there's a clip of a guy from Washington at the time, Lou Franciscetti, who runs an Islander player from behind, and there's like a pause, and you make your way over to him and let it be known that that's not going to be tolerated. I guess, would you agree in watching hockey now that's something that you maybe don't see as much as you did then?
Well, I wish we still did, because there has to be accountability, and I hate what I see some days in games where, even the little guys can get away with a lot of stuff, and I'm not saying little or big, it doesn't really matter, but people are getting away with a lot more. And I was taught by three guys: Gary Howard, Bobby Nystrom, and Clark Gillies.
Good teachers.
Yep, and that's how to stick up for yourself. And, sports is funny. In Al, I loved him so much because, someone runs you over, gives you a stick in the head or something like that. He would always say, how long do you think he's going to play in this league? And I would say, like each one of us would say years and years. And, I think I said at the time another 10 years. And he says, Are you going to get him back tonight? He says, why would you get him back tonight? He says, why not wait till next year or 2 years from now? He says he's going to be playing 2 years from now. And that was our philosophy, and it always came to fruition. We never, all these games, everyone says is going to be this retribution the very next game. Well, it never happens, right? But it does happen. It happens later, and it's going to happen sometime. And, I think all in all, those three guys taught me to be patient and just to get ugly once in a while. Because I had a bit of a temper, and I could flip the switch. And, it was, those days are way different. But I just would like to see more accountability. And even though you saw the scrap of Cassian and Tkachuk, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I liked what he did. I liked it. And there was no penalty there. There was none. And Tkachuk had blindsided him, twice within a minute. And I don't blame Cassie. I think there's got to be more accountability.
That's very interesting. And speaking of, now, so during his time with the Islanders, 77, 78, 79, the team comes up a little bit short to playoffs, has some good runs and some not, but the team remains patient and continues to build. I always give the Islanders credit for that because they didn't panic at any point to let you guys grow and mature. During that stretch, you, as a hockey player, reaching the 30-goal mark, the 20-goal mark with regularity. So that's a time when you're establishing yourself. The team is establishing itself. Do you feel at that point confident that you're, as a team, on the cusp of becoming a Stanley Cup champion?
Well, that's a really good question. The series that devastated us the most was against Toronto, right? In the 7-game series when Lanny McDonald scored in overtime. I think that was 78.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
That devastated us. And you know, as a kid, you're only 23, 24, and you're thinking, oh, you know, Bill's going to blow up the team. We're going to have a bunch of trades and stuff. Because I think we won first place in the league that year. The next year, I think we won first place again. And then the Rangers beat us. And that is just taboo. You can't lose to the Rangers when you're playing in New York. So
right.
We thought the team would really be blown up after that series. And Bill just hung in there with us. Hung in. And the year we won, the first year in 80, I think we finished 5th. Like, we didn't have a great year. But the key was March 10th, the trading deadline, we got Butchie Goring. And we never lost another game in the regular season. I think we went 10 or we won. And, you know, things just started to turn around, and we were really confident. You know, the greatest thing about being on a great team is you have a chance to win every night. And so many guys, like I look at these baseball teams and stuff, I mean, they're out of the standings by June or July, you know. And in hockey, we always knew we had a chance to win. And it embarrassed us when we lost in a regular season game. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what made us stronger and stronger. And then, of course, you know, against your team in the playoffs in 1980, that totally turned our team around.
That did, and that was the end of an era for the Bruins because, well, first of all, obviously you scored an overtime goal in Game 2, which gave you 2-0 to start. But physically, you guys went toe-to-toe with the Boston Bruins, coming out with a little bit of an advantage, but you were not being pushed around in the Boston Garden. I think of Gary Howard. I think of Knuckles Nystrom. I think of Clark Gillies. And as a fan at the time, I'm looking at it and saying, wow. I mean, it was almost, you could just feel it as a fan that these guys are serious. They are not going to get pushed around, and you certainly had the talent as well. So that was a real milestone series, just for me as a fan, obviously for you as a player.
Yeah, it was. It's certainly the series that made our team for the next few years. You know, they had I will always say this, they had the toughest team I've ever seen in the NHL.
Oh, yeah.
And not even close to Philly. Like, they were tough. They had Wensick and Secord, and they had O'Reilly and Cashman and Jonathan, and they just had the toughest guys. But we felt going into that series we were a better team, like, you know, skill-wise. Mm-hmm. And the brawl at the end of the first period in the second game is what changed the New York Islanders. And you know, Dog Sutter led the way, and Clarkie and Bobby Nye had already been thrown out of the game. But anyway, it was the ugliest brawl I've ever seen. And we just came, you know, luckily we were able to win the game, and we just came together after that because other teams saw that and said, okay, you can't play with us skill-wise, you can't play with us physically, so how do you beat this team? Well, they couldn't. And then Billy Smith was just brilliant in goal. And the most exciting thing was we just knew we had a chance to win every game. And we knew during that era we had a chance to win the Stanley Cup every year. And what a great feeling is that?
Oh, absolutely. Not too many players have that. You know, I had this discussion with a lot of players from that generation, very few teams were in that position, and you were. So, for example, the Canadians won the Cup 4 years in a row. You won it 4 years in a row. The Islanders, I think, won it. I mean, the Oilers won it another 3. So when you're in that position, being able to put it over the top was quite an accomplishment. And now for yourself, one of the things you're best known for, Bob, is the fact that you took your game to an even higher level in the postseason. And in that 4-year stretch of Stanley Cups, you averaged over a point a game and led the all-playoff scorers in scoring in 83. Was that something conscious? How did that develop, that when the postseason came, you seemed to ramp it up, where a lot of players around the league will, it's tougher checking, it's high intensity every night, maybe they'll take a step back. You took 2 steps ahead. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's funny because people ask me that all the time, but it's a very simple answer. I probably got twice the ice time in the playoffs I did during the regular season. And here's why. Like, Al was really good about playing 4 lines. Obviously Trotch and Boss got to play the most ice time. But in the playoffs, Al shortened the bench. And I used to play so much. And going back to Eddie Westfall is I learned how to kill penalties from him and Lauren Henning. And so I was killing penalties. I was on the power play. I was on a regular shift. And my advantage was, Mark, that I grew up as a center iceman. Al switched me to left wing, and I played there for 4 or 5 years. And then if somebody got hurt on right wing, I could play all three forward positions, right? Mm-hmm. And even during that Boston series, Mike Bossy missed the first 4 games. So I played right wing most of the time. And it wasn't natural for me, but I got so much ice time. And I really believe that had a lot to do with my point production. I got to play the power play an awful lot. Al even put me on the point in the power play sometimes. I just played a lot more. And during the regular season, I was satisfied if we played the 4 lines and we won the game and go from there. But I just played a lot more in the playoffs. And I was, and you're right, I was probably way more intense. And Clark Gillies is my best friend, and he and I used to drive from the hotel and to the rink together. Mm-hmm. And Clarky would just be wired all the time, like just wired. And so I had to be wired, Right. The intensity really grew in the playoffs, and once we got a taste of it, we loved it, and it worked out good. That's for sure. We talk about intensity and skill. One player I wanted to ask you about is, of course, I consider to be the best defenseman of that era, Denis Potvin. Talk a little bit about, I know it's obvious to the fans, but maybe something we don't know about Denis that a teammate appreciated, what he brought to that overall dynasty. Well, for me, when I went on the ice and Denis was there, like if I played left wing and he's a left defenseman, I wasn't worried about a thing. And it gave me the option to go harder offensively. It gave me the option to forecheck and to just not worry. He was so smart and he was so strong. And the thing with Denny was, I would always hang up the ice a little bit if he's on a one-on-one or something. Mm-hmm. He was the best passer I ever saw, ever. He could lift the puck 2 inches over somebody's stick and land it on your stick. His passes were so easy to pick up. But it just melted into you. He was brilliant that way, and just smart and strong. I just never ever worried. You want to be a good plus minus guy, right? And if Denis was on the ice, I just never worried ever, and that frees you up to do more things. Right. Well, I remember we
of course, growing up in the Boston area, but we would get WOR on cable, so I had a chance to watch that entire Islander sequence of years between the 75 and the dynasty years, and I always felt that Denis Potvin not only was smart, obviously talented, but boy, was he tough. He had a mean streak, and when you combine that with all the tough players you had to team, all your tough guys could really play hockey. That was the thing. You didn't have any goons or anything like that in that era, which was kind of predominant, but all you guys could really play, and so you had that and the toughness. The one element you did add in 1977, of course, was Mike Bossy, kind of a pre-Butch Goring. He was kind of I thought he was going to be the final piece, but talk a little about Mike, who was probably the greatest goal scorer of that generation.
Well, it's a funny story about Mike. We had, when you go to training camp, you always stare at your first round draft twice. Mm-hmm. You always wonder if it can this guy help our team and stuff, right? And I saw Mike skate the first few days, and I'm thinking, the guy can't skate. Can't. Like, he's from the Quebec League and blah, 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 and he scores a bunch of goals and stuff. But in the first game of that season, we're playing Buffalo, a very good Buffalo team with, Bear and Pro and those guys, Martin and those guys. And the game is 0-0 to about 3 minutes to go in the game. And Trotch passes it back to Bossy right inside the blue line. And just that little snapshot he had, it wasn't a slapper, just a snapshot. So I 1-0. Not 20 seconds later, he scores another one, too. We win the game 2-0. I said, okay, this kid can play. Mike was brilliant hockey player. Just brilliant. And he loved to play. And the one thing I'll say about Mike Bossy, he played in all the tough games. Like, he didn't disappear. Like, if we went into Boston, he was always our best player. If we went into Philadelphia, he was always our best player. And he would just get abused, but he hung in there, and it meant a lot to the rest of us. Well, if Mike can do it, then we can all do it, because he got abused badly.
Right. Well, you bring me to another question about, you're a very durable player during this era. I've very rarely missed games. But in order to do that, you've got to play hurt. And I suppose there was some point during this stretch of time in your career where you probably had the opportunity to not play and chose to play. I'm making an assumption here, but talk a little bit about playing through injuries. Well,
we had a really good training duo. We had great doctors. But there were certainly a few times, like, we talked about my fighting. I broke my nose 9 times, and that tells you what kind of fighter I was. But, you just went in the dressing room. If you had something wrong, you just went back out. And there was some times where, obviously, you have knee problems or something, you just can't play. But, I got in a fight one night in the playoffs, and I split my hand open for 10 stitches. And there's no way I should have played the other night or the next night, but I did. And they shot it all up and stuff. And I don't know what they do now. I think guys still get treatment and stuff like that. But you just expected to play. And, you were hurting a lot. And I know my back being so sore sometimes where I could hardly skate. But also, in those days, too, we were so afraid of losing our jobs, right? There's a kid in the minors that's ready to come up and play, and you just wanted to play. And the doctors had less input in those days. It was basically came down to the coaching and how you felt, and
right.
Can you go play? And I would just say to him, he says, can you play? And I would always say yes. So that's what happened.
Bob, as your Islanders career winds down, you were with the team for several years, obviously a heck of a career. But actually, before I talk to you about LA, I want to ask you about one more player, just because he recently joined you in the Hall of Fame with the Islanders. That's John Tonelli. So when you talk about Bill Torrey, again, to be able to draft him. He was in the World Hockey Association, of course, so he wasn't going to be with the team immediately, but able to have the foresight to draft him and talk a little bit about what he was one of my favorite players. Talk a little. He was just all out, and talk. I think you even played with him on the Canada Cup in '84.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, talk a little bit about John.
Well, I'll never forget one day. Al Arbor came up to me. I think I had a meeting in his office. So we were just talking about general stuff and and what I should be doing and all this other stuff. And he says, "Look, John Tonelli's going." I said, "Yeah, I hear that." And he's a left winger, and he said, "You are going to love him." And I said, "Well, that's great, because if we got left side of Gillies, myself and John Tonelli, then we're decent on the left side." And the thing with John was he was like a Wolverine. Like he almost fathomed at the mouth. Like he was so intense, so intense. And he got to play with Bobby Nyson, and the two of them just stayed on each other so hard. Like, Bobby's probably the hardest worker I ever saw in my life. Mm-hmm. So he would make Johnny work harder and harder and harder. And Johnny had a huge heart. And then Johnny would, like saying about Mike Bossy, would play tough in the tough buildings. And Johnny wasn't a fighter, neither was Mike, but they played tough, if you can figure that out, right? Mm-hmm. They still played tough. And Johnny's, I was talking to Denis Potvin, no kidding, just 2 days ago. And we were going over all the guys, and he said to me that if you took 16 of us won 4 Stanley Cups, and if you took one of those guys out, he said, would we have won 4 cups? And I don't think so. And I'm talking about Billy Carroll and guys like that who, Anders Keller or Tommy Johnson. Mm-hmm. I don't think if you took one of those guys, would we have won the 4. But I always think of Johnny because in that series against Pittsburgh in the second, and he scored the tying goal with about a minute to go, and he scored the winning goal.
Oh, yeah.
And so he was a wonderful teammate. I sat beside him for probably 7 or 8 years, and he was just... he got me more intense, and that's what teammates are supposed to be. Like, I didn't have that intensity, but the nervous tension sitting beside him just got me going, like,
that's funny.
Johnny was a great addition to our team.
When you joined the LA Kings eventually in 1986, what was you talk about the intensity and the tradition now that you've built in New York. What was the culture like in contrast in LA?
You know what, Mark, it wasn't that much difference, and here's why. Because Pat Quinn was coaching when I got there. And it was still very intense. The players were obviously a little bit different. If you don't understand the culture of winning, it's hard to get it, And my first year in LA was unfortunate for all of us there because the Edmonton Oilers were unbelievable, the Calgary Flames were unbelievable, and the Winnipeg Jets with Del Horchuk were unbelievable. So we had to play those guys 8 times a year. Mm-hmm. So we got killed most nights, and then... But Pat was unbelievable. But the funny thing is, I had one coach for 12 years with Al Arbor, and the next year I had 4 coaches in 1 year.
Right.
So, it was hard to have any continuity. We had Pat, and then Pat got caught up in that thing with Vancouver, and then we had actually Rogie Vachon came in, coached a couple of games, and then Mike Murphy came over, and then a name you mentioned, Robbie Ftorek, finally came in. So it was such a different culture, but Pat was so brilliant, and Robbie Ftorek was brilliant, like just brilliant. And everything started to turn around for them at that time.
Right. Bob, at 87-88, your final season, it's kind of a few great things happen. You're on the cover of Sports Illustrated, Sports of the Year, for your work in the community with various charities. along with other great athletes of that year. You win the Masterton Trophy, and National Hockey League. Both of those had to mean an awful lot to you.
Yeah, they did mean a lot. A team that I played on, we were playing with 5 future Hall of Famers and stuff, and then the accolades get spread very far and thin, and so those individual awards were very nice, and I appreciate them. I just had such a lousy year my last year, and I'm still embarrassed by it, but I got a couple of awards, and I'm very proud of them. And we raised a lot of money in Long Island for spina bifida. My son Jeffrey has spina bifida, so we raised a ton of money then, and I got rewarded.
No question. And did you know at the end of that 87-88 campaign that your career was over? Did you have the desire? You eventually went into coaching, but did you have the desire to play anymore, or what? Did you know that you had your career had run its course?
Well, I just had such a horrible year, and my wife at the time, we live in Borne, BC, and we had a house here. My son Jeffrey was going through a whole bunch of surgeries that year, and I just couldn't imagine living in LA and not being able to be here for him. So I packed it in. The funny thing is, I still had a year left of my contract, and they went and had that great year. Of course, Gretzky was there, and Robinson, and stuff. John Tonelli. It would have been fun to be there, but I just decided, family-wise, it was just better to come home and stay home.
Well, Bob, we really appreciate the time today. As I said earlier, I've been looking forward to talk to you for quite some time. It was a great career. I was glad to be able to watch a lot of it on cable TV with Shiggs McDonald, Tim Ryan, and Westfall, etc. But it was very good to talk to you, and congratulations on a great career, and hopefully we can get a chance to talk to you again soon.
Anytime. You're
Thanks,
more
Bob.
than welcome.
Take care.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. If you enjoy listening to the show, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing the show on iTunes. This helps make our podcast more visible and accessible to hockey fans around the world. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for the show, please contact me at prohockeyalumni.org or via social media at Pro Hockey Alumni. The Pro Hockey Alumni greatly appreciates your support.